Charleston, South Carolina, 1833. The cobblestone streets shimmer with summer heat, while grand mansions cast long shadows over bustling markets. Inside these walls of privilege, silver gleams on mahogany tables and crystal catches the light of 1,000 candles. But beneath this veneer of southern elegance, something darker simmers. In the kitchens, the pantries, the spaces where power meets vulnerability, a quiet revolution is brewing. One man, armed with nothing but knowledge, passed down through generations, and a patience sharpened by decades of suffering, is about to rewrite the rules of survival. His name was Samuel, and he would prove that the most dangerous weapon in any house is the one that feeds you. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because stories like this deserve to be remembered. The morning mist clings to Charleston Harbor like secrets whispered in the dark. Slave ships rest at anchor, their holds empty now, but their legacy written in every brick of every mansion lining the waterfront. This is 1833, and Charleston stands city built on the backs of those as the beating heart of American slavery, who would never taste its prosperity. Nearly half of all enslaved Africans brought to American shores passed through these very docks, and their descendants now populate every corner of the city's economy. They work the rice fields that stretch beyond the horizon. They build the houses that shelter their masters. They cook the meals that nourish their oppressors. And sometimes, very rarely, they remember that knowledge can be a blade. Samuel moves through the pre-dawn darkness with the practiced silence of a man who has learned to be invisible. His bare feet know every loose board, every creaking step, every shadow that might conceal his movements. At 62, his back is bent from decades of labor, his hands scarred from countless cuts and burns, but his eyes remain sharp, alert, calculating. He carries with him the wisdom of his ancestors, knowledge that traveled across an ocean in the minds of the enslaved, botanical secrets that could heal or harm depending on the hands that wielded them. The kitchen, where Samuel has worked for over 20 years, sits behind the grand Whitmore estate, a testament to Charleston's wealth built on human suffering. Steam rises from copper pots, while the first light of dawn filters through windows thick with grease and smoke. This is his domain, the one place where he holds power, where the men who own him must depend, where his knowledge matters, an ants, never realizing they'd on his skills. They trust him with their sust, have placed their lives in the hands of a man who remembers everything. Charleston's slave code is brutal in its precision. The 1740 law states clearly that any enslaved person who administers very act of teaching another abouters poison shall suffer death as a felon. The poisonous plants carries the same penalty. These laws exist because the white population understands, perhaps better than they care to admit, that knowledge of plants and their properties represents a form of power they cannot fully control. They can chain bodies, whip backs, and sell children, but they cannot extract from every mind the accumulated wisdom of generations. Samuel learned his craft not from books, but from whispered lessons shared in slave quarters after the masters slept. His grandmother, brought from the rice coast of West Africa, carry of plants. She taught him which in her memory the property's roots could ease pain and of hundreds which could cause it, which leaves brewed into tea could calm a fevered child, and which in larger doses could stop a heart. This knowledge was survival, medicine for those who had no doctor, comfort for those who had no hope. But it was also something else. It was power. The masters of Charleston live in a world of their own making, surrounded by luxury purchased with human misery. They attend elegant dinners where e'en sell. They discuss business over brandy. Wily-leaved hands serve elaborate meals on fine china. Enslaved children are sold in the markets just blocks away. They sleep peacefully in beds made by enslaved carpenters. their dreams undisturbed by the cries that echo from the slave quarters who serve them, are human, forgotten a fundamental truth, those. In their arrogance, they have beings with memories, with pain, with the capacity for both patience and rage. The Whitmore estate hosts Charleston's elite with regularity. Plantation owners from the surrounding low country gather to discuss crop yields and slave prices, debate the expansion of slavery into new territories. They, merchants, count profits from human cargo. Politicians feast on meals prepared by Samuel's hands, toast their prosperity with wine he has poured, never imagining that the quiet man who serves them might harbor thoughts beyond their comprehension. Samuel observes everything. He notes which guests prefer their meat rare and which avoid certain vegetables. He memorizes their habits, their weaknesses, their routines. When Judge Hartwell mentions his sensitive stomach, Samuel files the information away. When Colonel Morrison boasts about his iron constitution, Samuel remembers. When Reverend Blackwood speaks of divine providence while discussing the sale of a family, Samuel's jaw tightens, but his expression remains neutral. He serves, he listens, he remembers. The knowledge Samuel possesses extends far beyond simple cooking. He knows that castor beans, when properly prepared, can ease constipation in small doses, but cause violent illness in larger amounts. He understands that certain mushrooms growing in the marsh can be mistaken for edible varieties by those who lack his expertise. He has learned through careful observation which combinations of common herbs can mask the bitter taste of more dangerous substances. This knowledge has been tested, and no power except what they could create and refined, passed down through generations of people who has secret. But Samuel's true education comes not from plants alone, but from years of watching, learning the psychology of power and privilege. He sees how these men dismiss him as invisible, how they speak freely in his presence as if he were deaf. He witnesses their cruelties, their casual violence, their utter disregard for human life. Each insult, each act of brutality, each moment of callous indifference adds another layer to his understanding. They have taught him, without realizing it, exactly why his knowledge might one day be turned against them. The city of Charleston operates on rhythms dictated by slave labor. Before dawn, enslaved people rise to begin another day of unpaid toil. They light fires, prepare breakfast, tend horses, sweep floors, and perform the 1,000 tasks that keep the machinery of slavery running. The white population awakens to a world already in motion, their needs anticipated and met by hands they barely acknowledge. This system, so efficient in its exploitation, also creates countless opportunities for those patient enough to wait, observant enough to learn, and desperate enough to act. Samuel has been waiting for decades, not for freedom. That dream died long ago when he watched his son. Not for justice sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. The courts of Charleston offer none to those who look like him. He waits for something else, something harder to define but impossible to ignore. He waits for the moment when knowledge and opportunity align, when the very system that has oppressed him for so long presents him with the tools for its own destruction. The morning of July 4th, 1833, dawns hot and humid, typical for Charleston summer. Independence Day means celebration for white Americans, freedom proclaimed and toasted while millions remain in chains. The irony is not lost on Samuel as he prepares for what he knows will be his final service to the Whitmore estate. Today, 12 of Charleston's most prominent citizens will gather to celebrate their liberty. Today, Samuel will serve them a meal they will never forget. The grandfather clock in the Whitmore parlor chimes 7 times as Samuel begins his final preparations. Each toll resonates through rooms where portraits of dead slaveholders watch with painted eyes that seem to follow his movements. Today's menu has been planned for months, each dish carefully selected not for flavor alone, but for opportunity, oyster bisque to start, the cream thick enough to mask any bitterness. Roasted duck with wild rice, the dark meat perfect for concealing unwanted additions. Peach cobbler for dessert, the sweetness overwhelming to even the most discerning palate. The guests arrive in carriages that gleam like polished coffins. Judge Hartwell, his face flushed with self-importance and morning brandy. Colonel Morrison, chest puffed with medals earned crushing slave rebellions. Reverend Blackwood, clutching his Bible like armor against the sins he commits daily. 12 men in total, each one a pillar of Charleston society, each one responsible for countless acts of cruelty disguised as civilization. They enter the dining room with the confidence of those who have never questioned their right to own other human beings. Samuel serves the first course with hands steady as stone. The oyster bisque steams in delicate china bowls, each portion measured with scientific precision. He has learned through careful experimentation that timing matters more than dosage. Too much too fast, and suspicion arises. Too little, and the evening continues as planned. But the right amount, delivered at the proper intervals, creates something far more elegant. A symphony of suffering that builds slowly, note by note, until the crescendo arrives. The conversation flows as freely as the wine Samuel pours. These men speak of politics and profits, of new territories ripe for slavery's expansion. They debate whether the recent uprising in Virginia signals broader unrest or merely isolated madness. They laugh about difficult slaves who required correction, sharing stories of punishment with the casual air of men discussing the weather. Samuel moves between them like smoke, refilling glasses, clearing plates. His presence so familiar they speak as if he were furniture. Judge Hartwell raises his glass in a toast. To the natural order, he declares, his voice slurred with wine and righteousness. To the divine wisdom that placed inferior races under our benevolent guidance. The others join him, crystal clinking in celebration of their own perceived superiority. Samuel watches from the kitchen doorway, memorizing faces, cataloging final words. These will be the last toasts they ever make. The second course arrives with theatrical precision. Roasted duck carved at the table, the blade flashing in candlelight as Samuel portions each serving. The wild rice pilaf sits alongside, fragrant with herbs that mask more sinister additions. He has been gathering these ingredients for years, drying leaves in hidden corners, crushing seeds in the pre-dawn darkness, creating a collection that would terrify anyone who truly understood its purpose. But these men see only their trusted cook, the slave who has fed them faithfully for decades. Colonel Morrison compliments the seasoning, unaware that among the familiar spices lies something his body will soon recognize as foreign. Reverend Blackwood savors each bite, his appetite undiminished by the sermon he delivered just days ago about the biblical justification for slavery. The irony tastes bitter in Samuel's mouth as he watches them consume their judgment with obvious pleasure. The dining room fills with cigar smoke and boisterous laughter as the evening progresses. These men feel invincible in their privilege, surrounded by wealth built on stolen labor, protected by laws written to preserve their power. They have never imagined that resistance might come not from the fields where their overseers carry whips, but from the kitchen where their meals are prepared with seemingly loving care. They have forgotten that those who feed you hold your life in their hands every single day. Samuel retreats to his domain as the first course settles in their stomachs. The kitchen feels different tonight, charged with an energy that makes the air itself seem alive. Copper pots gleam like mirrors, reflecting distorted images of a man who has finally chosen his moment. The herbs hanging from the rafters release their secrets into the humid air. Botanical knowledge accumulated across generations of enforced silence. Tonight, that silence breaks. The chemistry of revenge requires patience and precision. Samuel has studied his subjects as carefully as any physician studies his patients. He knows that Judge Hartwell's weak stomach will react first, that Colonel Morrison's iron constitution will delay the inevitable, that Reverend Blackwood's constant anxiety will amplify every symptom. Each man will experience his own unique journey toward the same destination, a poetic justice that appeals to Samuel's sense of symmetry. As he prepares the final course, Samuel allows himself to remember his son's face when the slave trader's wagon disappeared down the dusty road, his wife's tears after she was sold to settle her master's gambling debts, the countless indignities, the daily humiliations, the systematic destruction of everything that made life worth living. This meal represents more than vengeance. It embodies the accumulated pain of everyone who suffered in silence, everyone who died without justice, everyone who was forgotten by history. The peach cobbler emerges from the oven golden and perfect, its crust hiding the final act of this carefully orchestrated drama. Samuel adds the finishing touches with an artist's attention to detail, each portion crafted to deliver its payload with maximum effect. The sweetness will overwhelm their palates until it's too late to notice anything amiss. By then, the evening's work will be nearly complete. He carries the dessert to the dining room where 12 men sit in various stages of discomfort. Judge Hartwell has loosened his collar, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's relative coolness. Colonel Morrison shifts restlessly in his chair, his usual bombast replaced by concerned glances at his companions. Reverend Blackwood clutches his stomach, his face pale beneath the chandelier's glow. The symphony has begun. Samuel serves each man his final course with ceremonial dignity. He meets their eyes as he places the dessert before them, these men who have never truly seen him as human suddenly forced to confront his presence. Something in his expression makes Judge Hartwell pause, spoon halfway to his mouth, recognition flickering in eyes growing dim with approaching fate. But it's too late for recognition, too late for understanding, too late for anything but the inevitable conclusion of a story written in botanical knowledge and seasoned with decades of rage. The dining room falls silent except for the soft scraping of silver against china. Samuel watches from the shadows as 12 of Charleston's most powerful men consume what they cannot yet comprehend is their final meal. The peach cobbler disappears spoonful by spoonful, each bite carrying them closer to a reckoning decades in the making. Judge Hartwell pauses mid-bite, his hand trembling slightly as he sets down his spoon. Something tastes different tonight, though he cannot place what it might be. Colonel Morrison attempts to maintain his usual bluster, regaling the table with stories of disciplining unruly slaves, but his voice carries less conviction than usual. Beads of perspiration form along his hairline despite the evening breeze that stirs the heavy curtains. Reverend Blackwood has grown unusually quiet, one hand pressed against his midsection while the other clutches his napkin like a lifeline. The natural order they toasted so confidently begins to shift beneath their feet. Samuel moves through the room with practiced efficiency, refilling water glasses and clearing empty dessert plates. His movements are deliberate, unhurried, those of a man who understands that time now works in his favor. These men who have controlled every aspect of his existence for decades suddenly find themselves subject to forces beyond their command. The knowledge they dismissed as primitive superstition reveals itself as sophisticated science, botanical wisdom refined through generations of necessity. The first to show obvious distress is Judge Hartwell. His face flushes deep red as he pushes back from the table, chair scraping against polished hardwood. The man who sentences runaway slaves to public flogging now struggles to maintain his composure as his body rebels against substances it cannot identify or expel. His breathing becomes labored, shallow gasps that interrupt his attempts to speak. The others watch with growing alarm as their host doubles over, clutching his throat. Reverend Blackwood rises unsteadily, his sermon about divine providence forgotten as waves of nausea crash over him. The Bible he carried into dinner lies abandoned on white linen, its pages unable to offer comfort against the biological imperative now coursing through his system. He staggers toward the door, seeking relief that will never come, salvation that exists beyond the reach of prayer or penitence. His legs buckle before he reaches the threshold. Colonel Morrison, proud of his legendary constitution, attempts to maintain control even as his vision blurs and his hands shake uncontrollably. The man who built his reputation crushing slave rebellions finds himself powerless against an enemy he cannot see or fight. His metals catch the candlelight as his chest heaves with the effort of drawing breath, each inhalation more difficult than the last. Pride becomes his final emotion as understanding dawns too late. The remaining 9 guests experience their own variations of the same inevitable progression. Some clutch their chests as hearts struggle against botanical interference. Others collapse where they sit, their bodies rejecting the very substance of their privilege. A few attempt to call for help, but their voices emerge as whispers that die in throats constricted by compounds older than their comprehension. The dining room transforms from a celebration of power into a theater of judgment. Samuel observes each man's decline with scientific detachment. He has studied their reactions, memorized their symptoms, cataloged their suffering with the same attention to detail they once applied to his purchase price. The knowledge his grandmother carried across the Atlantic now flowers in a Charleston mansion, African wisdom dispensing justice to those who believed themselves beyond its reach. Each labored breath, each desperate gasp represents a voice silenced, a family torn apart, a life reduced to property. The irony weighs heavy in the humid air. These men who proclaimed their superiority over races they deemed inferior now discover the true depth of knowledge they never bothered to acknowledge. The plants they trampled underfoot in their rice fields, the herbs they dismissed as worthless weeds, reveal themselves as instruments of precision more effective than any law they ever wrote. Samuel's education, acquired in slave quarters and hidden degrees and inherited wealth. One gardens proves more valuable than their formal by one. Charleston's elite succumb to forces conversation about natural order takes they never understood. They're on bitter meaning as their bodies demonstrate the actual hierarchy of power. Knowledge trumps privilege, patience overcomes force. The oppressed claims victory over the oppressor through methods as old as humanity itself. The dining room fills with the sound of chairs overturning, crystal shattering, and the desperate gasps of men who never imagined their authority could be challenged by someone they considered property. Dr. Pemberton, the plantation physician who once testified that slaves felt less pain than white people, now experiences agony beyond his medical understanding. His hands, accustomed to treating only white patients while ignoring slave suffering, flutter helplessly against symptoms no textbook ever described. The man who denied the humanity of others discovers his own mortality in ways that medical school never prepared him for. His final thoughts turn not to his patients, but to his failure to recognize the expertise that now judges him. Samuel retreats to his kitchen as the last of the 12 men lose their battle against botanical justice. The silence that follows their struggle feels different from any quiet he has known. It carries weight, finality, the sound of accounts settled and debts paid in full. The knowledge passed down through generations of the enslaved has spoken its verdict, and Charleston's dining rooms will never echo with quite the same arrogance again. The copper pots gleam in moonlight, streaming through windows that have witnessed decades of suffering. Samuel washes each dish with ceremonial care, cleansing away not just the remnants of the evening's meal, but the accumulated stains of years spent serving those who denied his humanity. His hands, steady throughout the evening's work, now shake slightly as the magnitude of his actions settles into his consciousness. He has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, committed acts that will reshape his world in ways he cannot fully predict. But as Samuel dries the final glass and hangs the last towel, he feels something he has not experienced in decades. Not happiness, the concept seems too small for the moment. Not satisfaction, the word carries too much lightness for such heavy work. Instead, he feels the deep peace that comes from completing a task that demanded everything he possessed. The knowledge his ancestors preserved through the horrors of the Middle Passage has finally found its purpose in a Charleston dining room. The grandfather clock chimes midnight as Samuel removes his apron for the final time. Independence Day has ended, but for the first time in his 62 years, the word freedom carries personal meaning. Not the freedom of movement or choice, those luxuries remain beyond his reach. Instead, he has claimed the freedom to act according to his own moral compass, to balance scales that justice never bothered to weigh. The botanical wisdom of his grandmother has authored a new chapter in Charleston's history, written in compounds that leave no trace but change everything. Outside, the city sleeps unaware that its social order has shifted beneath the cover of darkness. 12 empty chairs in the Whitmore dining room represent more than individual deaths. They symbolize the vulnerability of systems built on the assumption that the oppressed will remain forever passive. Samuel's quiet revolution demonstrates that knowledge, patience, and opportunity can combine to topple empires as surely as armies or legislation. The Spanish moss that drapes Charleston's ancient oaks whispers secrets in the pre-dawn breeze. Some secrets concern the botanical properties of plants that grow wild in southern gardens. Others involve the accumulated wisdom of people deemed too primitive for education. Tonight, these secrets have spoken truth to power in a language older than written law, more permanent than carved stone. The kitchen where Samuel worked for decades will soon become legend, the place where silence finally found its voice. As Samuel prepares to face whatever consequences await his actions, he carries with him the satisfaction of work completed with perfect precision. The men who gathered to celebrate their freedom have discovered that true liberty belongs to those brave enough to claim it. The knowledge they dismissed as ignorant superstition has proven more powerful than their weapons, more lasting than their laws, more just than their courts. In the end, the slave who cooked their meals has served them the one dish they never expected to taste: justice, seasoned with patience and served at exactly the right temperature. The morning sun rises over Charleston Harbor, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets that will soon echo with screams. By dawn, servants throughout the city discover what Samuel's midnight work has wrought. The Whitmore estate stands silent as a tomb, its windows dark, its grand entrance guarded only by Spanish moss that sways like mourning veils in the humid breeze. Inside, 12 bodies rest in positions that speak of struggle, of understanding that arrived too late, of a reckoning served with surgical precision. Word spreads through Charleston's white community like wildfire through dry rice fields. Carriages race between mansions as news carriers whisper of the impossible. 12 of the city's most prominent citizens, dead in a single evening. No signs of violence, no forced entry, no theft. Just silence where laughter once echoed, stillness where power once strutted. The dining room that hosted so many celebrations of white supremacy has become a monument to its vulnerability. But in the slave quarters, a different conversation unfolds. Hushed voices carry Samuel's name like a prayer, like a promise, like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud, yet too powerful to contain. Old women who remember Africa nod with knowing eyes. Young men who carry whip scars on their backs stand straighter despite their chains. Children who have never known freedom suddenly understand that the impossible might be possible after all. Samuel's name becomes legend before his fate becomes known. The authorities arrive with faces pale as Charleston cotton. Sheriff Morrison, no relation to the colonel who died choking on his own privilege, surveys the scene with hands that shake despite his attempts at composure. 12 prominent white men dead, and the only witness a 62-year-old slave who sits in the kitchen as if waiting for Judgment Day. The very concept challenges everything these men believe about power, control, and the natural order they've built their lives defending. They find Samuel exactly where he knew they would. Sitting on a wooden stool beside the cold hearth, his hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on something beyond their understanding. He doesn't run because running would suggest guilt, and Samuel feels none. He doesn't hide because hiding would imply shame, and Samuel has transcended such concepts. He simply waits as he has waited for decades, with the patience of a man who has finally completed his life's work. The interrogation begins before sunrise. Sheriff Morrison and Judge Patterson, hastily summoned from his bed, attempt to extract confession from a man who speaks only when spoken to directly. Their questions reveal more about their fears than Samuel's methods. How did you poison them? Where did you learn such devilry? Who taught you to kill white men? Samuel's answers come soft as morning mist, offering nothing yet confirming everything they already suspect. But Samuel understands what these men cannot grasp. They seek confession as if his guilt requires their acknowledgement. They demand explanations as if their comprehension matters to the scales of justice that have already balanced. They threaten consequences as if anything they might do could compare to the decades of consequence he has already endured. Their power extends only as far as their ability to inflict suffering, and Samuel has been suffering so long that additional pain holds no terror. The news reaches Columbia by afternoon, carried by riders whose horses foam with exhaustion and urgency. Governor Hayne reads the dispatch with disbelief that transforms quickly into rage. 12 prominent citizens murdered by a house slave using methods that leave no trace, require no weapon, offer no warning. The very impossibility of the crime makes it more terrifying than any armed rebellion. How do you defend against an enemy who serves your dinner with a smile? Panic spreads through South Carolina's planter class like cholera through a slave ship. If Samuel could eliminate 12 men in a single evening, using nothing but kitchen herbs, what prevents others from following his example? How many trusted cooks possess similar knowledge? Which meals might carry death disguised as hospitality? The paranoia that has always lurked beneath Southern gentility erupts into open hysteria. Emergency sessions convene in every major city. Laws that seemed comprehensive suddenly appear inadequate against threats they never anticipated. The slave codes that governed behavior and movement say nothing about botanical knowledge passed down through generations of the oppressed. How do you legislate against wisdom carried in memory rather than written in books? How do you control information that exists in the very plants growing wild in your gardens? Dr. Ravenscroft arrives from the Medical College of South Carolina, summoned to examine bodies that tell stories his medical training never prepared him to read. The symptoms suggest multiple causes. The timing implies coordination. The method demonstrates sophistication that challenges every assumption about slave capabilities. His autopsy reports read like confessions of ignorance, admissions that European medical knowledge cannot explain African botanical wisdom. The trial, when it comes, serves ceremony rather than justice. The courthouse overflows with spectators who come not for legal proceedings but for spectacle, for the chance to witness how the system responds when its fundamental assumptions are challenged. Samuel enters in chains that seem almost ornamental compared to the invisible bonds he has finally broken. His presence transforms the courtroom into theater, the accused becoming accusation incarnate. Prosecutor Grimsby presents his case with the desperate fervor of a man defending more than law. He speaks of civilization under attack, of social order threatened by ungrateful slaves who bite the hands that feed them. His words carry the hysteria of power confronting its own mortality, the shrill tone of authority forced to acknowledge its dependence on those it oppresses. Every sentence reveals more about white fears than black crimes. Samuel's defense, appointed by a court more concerned with appearance than outcome, offers little beyond procedural compliance. How do you defend a man who doesn't deny his actions, who refuses to claim innocence, who sits in judgment's shadow with the composure of a priest at altar? The legal system, designed to process guilt and innocence, struggles with a defendant who has transcended such categories. The witnesses tell stories that become legend even as they testify. House slaves describe Samuel's knowledge of plants, his careful attention to guests' preferences, his decades of faithful service that earned complete trust. Their words, meant to establish guilt, instead reveal the profound vulnerability of a system that depends on the loyalty of those it brutalizes. Every testimony exposes another crack in slavery's foundation. Field hands speak of whispered conversations in slave quarters, of Samuel's reputation as a healer, of knowledge passed down through generations of women who remembered Africa. Their accounts paint pictures of a parallel world existing alongside the official narrative, a universe of wisdom and understanding that white Charleston never suspected. The prosecution's case becomes an inadvertent education in the depth of what they have overlooked. The verdict arrives like thunder on a cloudless day. Guilty, of course, because guilt was predetermined before the first witness spoke. Death by hanging, because the system demands its pound of flesh, even when that flesh has already claimed its own justice. Samuel receives his sentence with the same composure he carried while serving his final meal, understanding that legal death pales beside the spiritual freedom he has already claimed. But something has changed in Charleston that no verdict can restore. The comfortable assumptions that once governed daily life lie shattered like crystal on a dining room floor. Every meal becomes suspect, every trusted servant a potential threat, every kitchen a possible site of reckoning. The knowledge Samuel wielded with such devastating effect exists in countless minds throughout the South, botanical wisdom waiting for its moment to flower. They execute Samuel on a morning when Spanish moss drapes the gallows like mourning veils. He walks to his death with steady steps, carrying secrets that will outlive his body. The crowd that gathers to witness justice discovers instead that some victories transcend the grave. In slave quarters across the South, his name becomes whisper and warning, proof that patience and knowledge can topple empires built on cruelty. Samuel's story reminds us that power has always been more fragile than those who wield it care to admit. In kitchens and gardens, in the spaces where the oppressed serve their oppressors, knowledge flows like water finding cracks in stone.